I want to introduce our panel before I bring them up here, just in alphabetical order. Jim Bailey has been a public and private school teacher in Ojai for over 15 years, and he is the co-founder of Rock Tree Sky in Upper Ojai, and he brings a fresh perspective and is such a main contributor of educational conversations in our community. Meredith Benson-Rice has been an educator for over 30 years and has been a teacher and administrator at 3 private schools in Ojai. She also brings a wealth of experience from multiple perspectives. Katie Brauda has served, so this is the person who's doesn't live in Ojai, one of the two. She has served in Los Angeles County Board of Education and helped start one of the first K-12 charter school complexes in the country. So we want Katie here to provide a perspective that is outside of the Valley and also one that can serve in terms of scale and also policy. So that's why we have Katie here. Tiffany Morse is our new superintendent of Ojai Unified School District, and we are thrilled to have her here. This summer, she held 3 Engage to Impact events. Hopefully, many of you attended some of those, where she actively met with the community to find out what needs are you having in the community, what are the hopes that you have for Ojai Unified School District, and I think we're going to see a lot of changes in Ojai Unified as a result of her work. Elizabeth Reyes is a professor at Thomas Aquinas College, and she has been a tutor for Agora for many of our seminars, and we're thrilled to have her here, especially to represent a private college's perspective that has a particular focus. And then Richard Yao is Vice President of Student Affairs of California State University Channel Islands, which has 7,000 students, and he's going to bring his perspective of a large public university, what the needs are, how they see higher education changing in our environment, and we're thrilled to have our panel here. Please welcome them.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. Gosh, there are a lot of different things you could be doing today besides being in here. It's a lovely afternoon in Ojai. We could be out playing golf or hiking or resting under a wonderful tree in the shade, and instead we're here for a couple hours to talk about education. That's inspiring to me that you all are willing to come out here and help us support this effort. What we try to do with this Chautauqua, with the Chautauqua panels, is to address important and controversial issues. And our goal is to discuss them openly amongst a group of friends who are colleagues and who have differing points of view. And in the course of that discussion, we think we will open up the issue and benefit your knowledge. In some sense, we will educate you about the topic. That's the whole premise of this idea. We feel free to disagree with each other. In fact, we encourage disagreement. We don't see that as a negative thing. We see it as a positive thing. But unlike what you see in public discourse most of the time, our way of doing that is not to have a food fight about it or to create a lot of animosity or a lot of energy or a lot of competitiveness, but rather to try to understand the other person's point of view. And we think out of that dialogue comes something beneficial and something good, and you get a chance to learn about something that you might not have an opportunity to learn about some other way. So important and controversial. The whole series, the whole set of questions around education are both important, are all important, and controversial. On the important side, it's really hard to overstate just how important they are. I mean, it may be that education is the most important thing that's happening right now, that our ability to educate not just students, but adults, toddlers to lifelong learners. It may be that our ability to do that is the way we build a society. It's the way we influence culture and institutions, our political system, and our capacity to solve problems at every level. Indeed, effective democracy depends on an educated constituency. So we all kind of know that. I'm sure I didn't say anything that's new to you, but we as a society don't act like we know it. In fact, we act like it's a foreign idea. We don't want to give resources to it. We scream like hell if we have to pay for it. When people come to Ojai, one of the things that they almost always ask is, how are the schools in Ojai? It's a very common question among newcomers. How are the schools in Ojai? So it matters, they care, but that's kind of where it ends. So like, how are the schools? That's your problem. That's not my problem. That's not anything I'm connected to. I just want to know, how are you doing this thing that you're going to provide for me? And that obviously isn't going to make sense. So at the same time that it's really valuable, it's also controversial. And it's controversial within the community of people who do education. It's also controversial within the community in general. What's the purpose of education? What is it we're trying to do? Are we preparing people for jobs? Are we preparing them to be better citizens? Are we affecting their personal, psychological, and/or spiritual development? Is that the thing? Is it about their fulfillment as individuals? That's what we want them to be able to do. Is it about their ability to lead? And then what's the best way to get there? I mean, how should we go about it? Should we set standards? If we set standards, on what basis should we set them? How do we define progress? How do we measure the effectiveness of a school system or of a particular way of educating people? Should there be standardized testing? Should there be accountability? Should we have charter schools? What's the role of the teachers' union? What about various curriculum models? How does the conveying of values fit in to the overall picture? And then maybe most important, or equally important, how does education keep up with changing times? So in the last even 5 years, technology has changed so rapidly, and the availability of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge and the way people learn and find out things has changed radically. Does that influence, should that influence what we think of as the purpose of education? Should it influence state and federal policy? How should public education be funded? It goes on and on. Now, it's noteworthy that public education is unique in our system of government in that we force families to educate their children. I say it that way intentionally for effect, because we sort of forget that. But education in this country is not an option, it's required. You have to do it. We have truant officers that will go around and catch you if you're not doing it. And, there's some repercussion in the system if you're not doing what you have to educate your kids. We provide you some choice on what way you can do it. There are various options. But you can't say, no, I don't think I want to educate my kids. And it's been that way a long, long time. The country was sort of founded on that. So that brings a certain set of problems and a certain set of obligations to the public educator. How is it that we deal with the variety of issues and constituencies when they are forced? And what if the family that the child is coming from doesn't really have a value for it, don't really care about it, have to do it? So the kid's pushed into the room, maybe not prepared very well for being educated. So there are a bunch of interesting questions. So with that as background, the first question that I would like to ask is this. We would like to hear, I'm speaking to the panel now, your thoughts and experiences about what the purpose of education is, but we would also like to hear in some detail about what might be unique or different about your belief and approach compared with other panelists. So Richard, can you start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I would say at the most basic and fundamental levels, one of the main purposes of education obviously involves some type of knowledge acquisition, right? And at the higher education level, we're talking about discipline-specific content expertise, right? Knowledge in your discipline, your major, your area of study. But I think we all know that our educational experiences, I would say, are definitely much more complex and layered and nuanced than just knowledge acquisition. And that's because we know that educational experiences across the lifespan. So if you think about our early childhood programs, our K-12 programs, community college vocational training, bachelor's level, graduate, doctoral level training, we know that our educational experiences across the lifespan have a profound and significant impact not only on our academic development and our professional development, but I think most importantly, our psychosocial development. So it's a much more holistic perspective. And if you think about it, as we progress through our educational experiences, in many ways, it forces us, it requires us to do a few things, and one of those is move out of our comfort zones a little bit. We have to take on new challenges, and I think even most importantly, we have to develop new skills if we are going to be successful in that endeavor. And if you think about, I'm sure everyone in here can relate, if you've ever been doing all three at the same time, it's not a pleasant place to be. In fact, it's hard, it's trying, it's stressful, filled with some level of anxiety and vulnerability and self-doubt. And to me, that's the heart of what we're trying to help students do in education. How do we help them build that resilience and grit to overcome adversity, to overcome failure? How do we get them to know about growth mindset, this idea that their cognitive abilities are not fixed? We used to think our cognitive abilities were fixed. We now know that they're fluid and dynamic. How do we help them develop multicultural perspectives to think about new ways of their place in the world, their own behavior and the behavior of others, and how do we help them identify our biases? There's a robust literature based on our cognitive biases. We all have them, and they function at a very unconscious level at times. So for me, that's the heart of what we're trying to do in education, and I would say that some type of education, formal education, should be required to accomplish those goals, because you're not going to make progress in that type of growth unless you're exposed to different people, different ideas, new places, different readings, different literature, and I think the formal education environment across the lifespan provides that opportunity. So for me, personally, that's how I like to approach the purpose of education, a combination of that content-based learning, but also those other skills like grit and perseverance, because it's obviously going to help them academically, but I know that these skills will benefit them in all aspects of their lives. So that's kind of my approach to education.
Great.
Thank you.
Other comments? Meredith, what do you think about that? You have a different view or the same one?
It would be really hard to add to that. That's pretty comprehensive. I mean, I think that what has changed is that some of these things that you're mentioning, 25 years ago were considered, very progressive and very radical. The idea that you would spend any time on, say, developing self-awareness, or understanding the behavior of others, or any of those kind of holistic approaches were seen as really forward thinking, and now they have become much more mainstream as what we all recognize as good education. I think that the thing that I would probably add to that is that I also feel that schools have this opportunity to be communities where you have multiple age groups together, and you are exploring some of these questions together as kind of like in a living laboratory. I feel like what has happened is that things like the extended family has broken down somewhat in modern society. Less people belong to, say, a church group or a club or something like that. And schools, particularly small schools, provide this community where people can develop a sense of belonging and connectedness. And really, it's like a microcosm of society then. So you get practice in navigating these things before you are actually an adult going out into the world. So that's the only thing I'd add to it, because I think that you really covered almost everything that I would have said, except possibly maybe, in my world of pre-K through 12 education, it also includes some sort of exposure to the arts and music and nature, outdoor education, that kind of thing, making sure that there's room in our curriculum, that it's not just fixed so that there's room in our curriculum to pursue personal interests and passions and support a learner in those things. I know, big proponent of self-directed learning, as I know Jim is and many of the other people up here are too, so that kids also have some agency in their education. I think that has become increasingly evident that students disengage if they aren't included in what they're learning. They have to be part of the equation. So we can't leave the student out of the conversation. That's the only thing I'd add.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Merity's saying about the engagement issue and the kids being involved in that process. And I liked what Richard had to say about the value and the importance of school, of learning environments. He used the term formal, and I would like to expand that and spread that out and say, informal learning environments are important too, that learning happens all the time, everywhere, and I think the formality of our learning environments has maybe moved away from how we all are as humans. We have this model where we accept a standardization, everybody's at the same place at the same time largely, and it doesn't serve the way that we as human beings have evolved to learn over time. We see that kids walk at different ages, we see that they talk at different ages, yet if you're not on grade level, we all know what that means with your reading. You're going to get pulled out, you're going to send to that other room, and then there's a label right there, and something's going to be said about it on the schoolyard. So I think I think we're overly formal with our education process, and I would like to see real student voice involved. I think that would be a difference. You talked about the value of education to democracy. Yet where's democracy in our education environments? It's strictly a top-down authoritarian structure. I, as the teacher, am telling you what you're doing and when you're doing it. And I think that fundamentally is killing engagement, it's killing motivation, and it's killing something beautiful that's inherent in being human. So I think we need to expand those things into the discussion. Thank you.
So I think this is a really important question because surveys out there where they try and ask the population, what do you think the purpose of education is? They all come back with mixed bag. Nobody agrees on what the purpose of education is. So some people say about 50% of people, according to a PDK study a couple of years ago, say 50% is just straight academics, 25% think it's developing citizens for this democracy, and 25% think it's teaching essential job skills. So the community doesn't agree. So it's really hard as a system to provide an outcome when whatever you do, some portion of the population doesn't think that's the right outcome. And you see this all the time with people who are constantly saying, you should teach this in school, you should teach this in school, you should teach cooking, and you should teach economics, and you should teach health, and you should only teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, and you should teach ethnic studies, or you shouldn't teach that. It's really difficult to try and balance that, and that's really a fundamental outcome of this question is, what is the goal? And we as a society don't agree on the goal. But I think we have this or thinking, it has to be one of those, and I would say you can design classrooms and schools and systems that do some of all of that, right? We can't fit all of those things into the curriculum, we just can't, and every time we try and replace something with something new, then half the people are mad about that, and that's okay, but we have to evolve. But I would say is our goal is really to develop innovative classrooms where children learn deeply and joyously as they gain purpose, agency, and essential skills. So those essential skills that we were talking about grit and mindset, those are really important, but I think the context is what kind of learning environment do we want for kids, not necessarily what is the outcome to society of education.
Right. What we want for kids.
Katie, what do you think?
Well, it's it's fascinating listening to everybody's points of view on this. I think that I probably do, as Andy suggested, bring more of an overall policy perspective rather than a pedagogical approach to this, because that's not my personal experience. When I think of what the parents we work with would look for as the purpose of education, it's probably to make sure that their kids become successful in life, and whatever that means. For a lot of them, it means having access to a higher education, and that they become productive members of society. So those are two kind of really big, broad goals that are very societal in context, but what does that mean in terms of, and my perspective is also K-12 rather than higher education. So what does that mean in the K-12 setting? One of the things it should mean is that we have an opportunity to level the playing field in that K-12 setting so that all the families that come into the system have access to that kind of preparation for life. And obviously, that means those basic skills, but it also means a lot of those skills that we are now so much more focused on, like grit and persistence and valuing each other as human beings. Those are all a big part of it. I think that's something that's such a big, larger question than the overall purpose of education that I'm going to leave that to all these experts here to figure out. But the only thing I would say finally is that when we speak about that mandate, I think we should think of it in terms of a mandate for the government, not a mandate to the populace. It's their right to an education. That mandate means that the government has a responsibility to provide that best education for kids. So that's my thought.
Elizabeth, you want to add?
Yeah, I love listening to what everyone has to say. I feel like I'm learning so much. And I think that while the college where I teach, it's very different. And so the language we would use would be very different. I think there's elements of what everyone said in the way that Thomas Aquinas looks at education. And for me personally, I was thinking about this question. I was thinking, well, it seems like there's got to be some kind of leading, that if educators, I think what Jim said seems absolutely right, that it can't just be top down, but there also has to be some leading. Otherwise, we just sort of put a bunch of people in a room and let them do whatever. So it does seem like some balance. I had a teacher once who said something really controversial and fascinating. She said, her claim was that the relationship between educator or teacher and student was as ancient and vital as the relationship between parent and child. And she said that since people existed, they've always been sort of getting together with some other person who would show them things. And that seems to me to get at something that's just in us as humans, whether we're little babies or we're, very late in life, that there's something in us that wants to learn, that takes joy in it. And so it seems to me that education, part of it, of course, as has been said, needs to enable us to do practical things, allow us to live and live well. But I think there's also part of it that just feeds that part of us that always wants to learn. And I just read with the freshmen at TAC this wonderful essay written in during the Second World War about learning in wartime. And the question was, how can we justify studying these things while our friends are being killed? And we might be killed any time. And at the core of that, what that writer suggested was, there's something in us that can't wait, because it's always true, we could die at any moment. But there's something in us as humans that wants to learn and wants to know. So that's why it's such an honor to be able to work at the Thomas Aquinas College. I don't think there's one way to do it. So I love hearing all the different ways. I do like the way that Thomas Aquinas does it. I think that they do get at some of what everyone's been suggesting, especially the involvement of the students, because they're really given the responsibility to read these works. I'm not a lecturer, I'm just a guide as their tutor. So they really are taking it into themselves. Now, we have the luxury of being really small. As I know, Richards University, they have to teach a lot. So there's a real question there, but those are some of my ideas.
So, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add on a couple of thoughts. One, it's interesting, the self-directed learning pieces, and we're seeing that in higher education now. We know that placement tests sometimes are not the best predictor, like English placement, math placement. We're now allowing self-directed English placement into college level English, but with some guidance, right? So there's a middle ground there, and I would agree with what Elizabeth said. In higher education, at least as a psychologist, I know for my psychology majors, I have to provide a little bit of guidance as to what those essential concepts that they need to learn. But also in terms of the higher level concepts such as grit and growth mindset and multiculturalism. I think it's up to us as public institutions to embed those concepts in the curriculum, right? So no matter what psychology class I may be teaching, we know that there's cultural pieces to everything that we do. Multiculturalism goes beyond race and ethnicity. It includes spirituality, it includes geographic location, it includes our various identities that we have. And we can embed that into the curriculum. It's very natural because it involves everything that we do in life. We can develop growth mindset and grit by maintaining our rigor and standards in higher education. We talk about increasing graduation rates. One of the things I hear back from the community members all the time is, well, are you lowering your academic rigor to meet those graduation goals? And I say absolutely not. We have to maintain our level of rigor to ensure that we're developing that grit and perseverance, but also at the same time making sure we're providing those supports that are necessary. And back to what Katie was saying in terms of access, I think that's really important, because if we work with 60% of our students at Channel Islands are first generation college students, first ones in their families go to college. It is not easy to navigate all the logistics of getting into college. I'm vice president of student affairs. My son's at San Diego State. I had trouble navigating that, and I'm vice president of student affairs. And he even said to me, he's like, Dad, how do first generation college students do it? I would have given up by now, right? So how do you complete a FAFSA? What is a bursar? What is a registrar? I got to do this orientation thing. So I think providing that level of guidance in the high school years, that's why I love the Gear Up programs, the TRIO programs, because it provides that level of mentorship, and we call it, fancy word, navigational capital in higher education, but how to navigate those systems that are really foreign to a lot of first generation students.
So I think I speak for some subset of the audience when I say, if to the extent that what you're doing is academics, and to some extent citizenship in the sense of understanding the founding principles of the Republic and what your role is and so on. I'm fine. I'm not worried at all for sending my kids to your school. But when you move to purpose, agency, self-awareness, understanding others, I start getting a little nervous. And if it's a private school, I'm a little less nervous, because I know at a private school I can go there and I can say, look, tell me what you mean by these words, and if I don't like it, I'm not going to send my kid there. But that's not perfect, because I might not really understand what you said, and I might send them, and then I don't want to take them out. And so I'm kind of wedded to you even after 1 year. It's not perfect. But if it's a public school, I'm even more nervous about it, because now I'm giving you the job of educating my child in a way that maybe I really don't want somebody else to do. I don't want their version of what it is to be self-directed or to have self-awareness. I mean, I don't know what that's going to mean to you, self-awareness. I mean, there are versions of self-awareness that I don't want my kids to know. So can we dig in just a little bit and talk about what does it mean to prepare a student for citizenship? That's something that you've all mentioned in one way or another. What does that mean?
So if I could start, I think what you were talking about before, what you might be more comfortable is what Paulo Freire called the banking model of education, and that is a transactional. So I, the teacher, am going to give you, all the things that you can then put in your, deposit box, and these are the things that you're going to learn. And I think education and learning is more powerful than that. But I can understand, and I've met families who do have discomfort with that. I've met families who have strong discomfort with me teaching evolution in a science class. And I would have to say, and I did say, that's what I'm going to do, because that's what's important to be in society and citizenship. But, to bring it back to citizenship, how do we do that? And I think modeling, Richard talked about that guidance piece, that you don't just, in a self-directed model. I think the guidance piece comes from modeling. And I think, unfortunately, in standard conventional classrooms, the teacher's not allowed enough time to model their own curiosity, to model their own growth educationally. And that is powerful. I mean, when kids see that you too are still learning, and you are somebody that they trust, they are in a relationship with, I think that's motivating, and they move along with it if it becomes the norm of the environment. I think another piece of citizenship is that piece of having a say. I mean, we want kids to take part in the running of this country, but we don't want them to take part or allow them to take part in the running of their classroom, by and large, except for a few little trite things like, we're going to decide the class rules for the year, but I'm really going to guide you to these 6. Right? So it's a little scary for adults and I think all of this stems from a high-stakes testing standpoint, because if you know at the end of the year that your principal is going to come to you or in your school district is going to get put up on a page and they're going to say, you didn't quite make the mark on these things, I think it lends teachers who are in it for the right reasons to move towards more authoritarian structures of behavior management and say, yeah, that's nice, but you need to sit down and get this done because my keister's on the line. And I think that's the damage. It's systemic, and it needs to shift, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously in a very different boat because we don't have, someone that's going to come in at the end of the day with the standardized tests and do that. So there's a little more opportunity to have a democratic classroom, even though, it is not that the students decide everything. I mean, it is a true democracy in that, the teacher also has a say as well.
Yes, of course.
But I really want to come back to...
Sorry, can I interrupt you? Do you really mean true democracy, or do you mean that that word is used, but really the teacher is kind of guiding with an invisible hand? You see what I'm saying?
I would say that most of our teachers are really skilled at knowing when there is a real opportunity to practice that. I mean, we agree as a society to stop at stop signs. So it's not like every day we renegotiate it, so it's not like it's happening all the time. But I think that our teachers are pretty skilled at knowing when there is an opportunity. And I would say, I think it was Tiffany who mentioned, we have to have some balance in here because you're trying to meet many different perspectives, and we might not go all the way one way or all the way another way. But I really wanted to come back to something that you mentioned earlier before you brought up citizenship, which was about this fear of teaching about self-awareness. And I really want to address it because I think that there's a big understanding. It's like you don't teach self-awareness, right? It's that you provide opportunities to observe what is going on in you, what is going on in others, and what's happening in our group. And through just that observation and allowing kids to have a conversation about that, I think it increases self-awareness. So it's not like, it made it sound like what your fear was is that the kids would be indoctrinated. Mm-hmm. And it's not about indoctrination at all. It's about providing opportunities for kids to dig deep into those very philosophical questions about life that they're really interested in, even in kindergarten. Just making space for that to happen. So it's about making space for those conversations. I just wanted to be able to clarify that.
Yeah. And it takes time, too. I want to add space and time. These things are not easy.
Just to get back to this concept of what makes a good citizen or a good member of society, I think one of the things that is important, and Richard addressed this somewhat, is this idea of multicultural awareness and acceptance. So the point is that we do need to learn how to value one another in order to be good citizens, I think. And part of that is having access to the truth. So really letting our students, giving them the opportunity to learn what really has happened. There's a big question now about addressing slavery, for example, in this country. What is the real history of how this country started and evolved? All of these things are essential and critical to a fuller valuing of each other in society, along with this idea of teaching critical thinking so that it's not just thrust down the students' throats. So I think the combination of making sure that we're giving them the full knowledge giving the students in our society a complete picture of what they need to know to be part of this society in a productive way is essential, and the idea that they should have the opportunity to discuss it among themselves and in a well-directed manner is something that I don't think is happening enough in our schools now. So that's a piece that I think is really important here.
It seems to me, too, that ties in really well with what Richard was talking about in your opening statement, I believe, about having students question their assumptions and their biases.
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of piggyback what everybody's saying. I would agree with you that exposing students to different ideas and new things is not indoctrinating them, right? It's just exposing them to that. But we have a responsibility as educators to make sure that we're exposing them to, as you said, the entire array of literature and information that's out there. And I think that's a big part of what we do and part of citizenship. You know, one of the things that I focus on with my students is, what do you do when you're faced with information and data that goes against what you believe, your conclusions, your life experiences, right? What do you do with that cognitive dissonance? There's many ways to go about it. A lot of times we just ignore it. I think confirmation bias is a beautiful example of that, and that's well established in the literature, the idea that we can have 1,000 pieces of information and only 10 of those actually agree with our view, and we just ignore the other 900 plus. And teaching students to be aware, how do you do that? And that's what we do, especially with the writing pieces. When you're developing scholarly arguments, what do you do when you're faced with evidence that it's counter to what you believe? And that doesn't mean it changes your mind, or we're trying to change your mind, but we want to start that process of self-reflection. What do you do with it? How do you evaluate that evidence? Maybe how you evaluate it says that it's not valid evidence. Well, that's fine, but it takes time to do that. So for me, that's a big part of that exposure. And in terms of the biases, confirmation bias is one, but also I think as a citizen, how we interpret the success and failure of ourselves and others is big, right? I think we have a tendency, when we as individuals experience success, I say because, I'm a hard worker, I'm intelligent, I do it the right way, but if I fail at something, my conditional response is, well, the economy's not great right now, it's a bad situation. But when we look at the success and failure of other people, it's inverse. When they're successful, we say in our political discourse now, oh, these wealthy folks, they're successful because the system is rigged for them, right? And just the inverse, when we see generations of people in poverty, we say, well, it's not because of the system, it's because, well, they don't value education, they don't value this. So I think just being aware of those types of biases and how we incorporate information that contradicts our belief system is a big part of making an effective citizen.
So what does it mean to think critically? And how do you go about teaching it? I mean, it's out there, right? It's in everybody's mission statement that you all folks have in your packets, and in every banner of every school is, we teach critical thinking. We don't all mean the same thing. How do you teach critical thinking?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question, because I was just noticing we were sort of circling around, and I was wondering, what do we have in common and what's different among the panelists when it comes to this question? Because a lot of the things that are being said, it makes sense, although I become uneasy when talking about listening to the idea that everybody's got bias and the data might be compromised. I start to feel unsteady, like, well, where can I rest? All of those things that you all are saying there seems to be truth to it, but I also, for my students, want to be able to pass on something that they could hang on to no matter what side they end up being politically or wherever they end up going, whether the history books end up being overturned or not. What can we give them that they can take and use to navigate that? The way we go about it at Thomas Aquinas is some of the old-fashioned things like logic. We give them a logic class, and I enjoy that class a lot because what we'll do sometimes is we'll talk about advertisements after we've gone through thinking about the different kinds of arguments, just to give them a chance to think about what are the underlying assumptions, which I think goes along with what's being mentioned. And it gives them a chance at the same time they're working Euclidean demonstrations, so they're seeing arguments at play. And it's very simple initially and very pure. But that together with the conversational style that we're able to have, I think really helps them learn to really, this is where the critical thinking comes in, to really listen. When they're reading, to really pay attention to what's being written, or when someone's speaking, to really listen in a way that waits to judge, but just tries to understand it. And then they're given the chance to think about, okay, well, what are the assumptions? What's the argument here? And there's always going to be a whole lot of questions. A lot of, it could be the case that what I feel like is true now might not be later, but one of the things that I love about this college is that we clearly and explicitly are trying to give them the tools just to learn how to think, so that no matter what they end up doing, they've got some tools. But so critical thinking when it comes to Thomas Aquinas College would be how to read, how to recognize an argument, to understand what kind of argument you're talking about, and then how to make one yourself. And also to be self-reflective enough to admit when your argument didn't hold, and not to take it personally. And they become very good at that, which is a wonderful to see.
So I think when we say critical thinking, it looks different in every subject, but critical thinking encompasses this bigger idea of solving problems and being able to take information where you don't have all of the components and to put that together in a way and use that in some meaningful way. And I think really what we're getting at is education has changed from kind of what Jim was talking about, the transactional banking model, to we give you all the information because the information is not available. A kid can Google any question we ask them in 30 seconds and have an answer. We have to change the way that we teach. We have to change what we're asking students to do. Whether you call that problem solving or project-based learning or critical thinking, what we're saying is the rote memorization of information is no longer a meaningful education, and we have to think about how we ask students to behave and think differently.
I have a question about that, though. You might be able to Google facts, right, and information, but you not necessarily, if you Google what is justice, right, Socrates' famous question, the answer that Google's going to give you, that's what the microphone thinks about what I'm saying. The answer that you're going to get from Google doesn't necessarily get to the wisdom, right? This is a perennial question, so
that's where critical thinking comes in, right? Yeah. It's not about memorizing the definition of justice, it's about being able to Google justice, get 25 definitions, and then think about which one is most applicable in the situation in which you're talking about. That's what critical thinking is.
Yeah, that's great. And it might even take you, your Google search might take you to Socrates' dialogue, and then you could read that. And Wikipedia could take you there too.
Read Socrates' dialogue yourself?
Imagine that.
Really?
I certainly know I read a lot of arcane and interesting stuff that I never read in school, and I think that, and nobody's making me do it. Wow.
If this interests you, by the way, one of the things we're doing soon that Andy mentioned is Plato's dialogue, the Meno, which addresses this question 3,000 years ago.
Nice plug, Tom.
Yeah.
So I want to further what Tiffany's saying in that it creates a real challenge for us to come up with what should be taught. John Dewey said maybe we could make it simpler and just teach whatever anybody wants to know in the moment, trying that emergent lesson. And I think, my colleagues who are really skilled can really, hear a kid ask a question and then have a toolkit to know what to bring in. But another great person who thought about education quite a lot, Seymour Papert at MIT, he said, he pointed out that what we put as our standards is about 1/1,000,000,000 of 1% of what it is possible to know out there that's in the world. And yet we've decided that we think we know this is best. When's the last time you used the quadratic formula? I have never used it in my life. And I imagine if I needed to use it, I would have found my way to it. So I think, we need to change a model towards, an inquiry model, asking questions and supporting learners and kids in what is unique in their desire to learn about. We need to be consultants, I think, and less carpenters. We're not trying to shape anybody. I'm not trying to shape anybody, I should say, but I want to support the plant as it grows. What's the soil? What's the water? How can I create a rich environment? And I think that's a way that we can maybe move the system to be more of a support system and less of a authoritarian.
So Tiffany raised, I think, a really good point about the way knowledge transfer has changed in the last 10 years, even in the last 5 years. And so I guess my question is, should the purpose of education change as technology changes?
You know, I think that some of it is how we're using the question, the purpose of education, because in some ways, I would still have the same answer no matter how much technology changed, that I would say the purpose is still, I want, you know, us to be assisting students to reach their full potential as adults to live a purposeful life, you know, or in short, no matter how you get there. I think the how you get there might change. So how do we do it might change with the use of technology. And it's certainly, you know, I mean, you could do a whole thing on what's happening with technology in schools and kids and their minds and how it's rewiring their brains. And, you know, I mean, a lot of schools, including mine, are both open to that shift in using technology as a tool, but very wary of overuse of technology, where you've got, you know, a kid addicted to their cell phone and wants to check their messages all day long, and it's a complete distraction in the classroom. And we have to address that in some way, even though that very same device can be used as a tool for calculus or what, you know, whatever. It's certainly changing the way they get there, but I would say I would still answer the broader question of the purpose of education in the same way, no matter what.
So the end doesn't change, but the means might change.
Yeah.
Does that seem right to people generally? Okay.
Can I say, it's a fascinating question. I love that you brought up both the use and the fear. And I'm just fascinated noticing myself and in others how it changes our kind of internal senses. The rapidity, just the way that we think something in there's going faster. I wonder, I mean, back to Socrates, I think somewhere he said he didn't like writing because people didn't memorize things anymore. And writing, I mean, books are technology, right? I mean, we have to learn, start on the left, go to the right, go from top down. It's a kind of technology. But he saw that we lose something. So it's a great gift, but we always lose something. So people weren't memorizing the Iliad anymore. They were leaving it in a book. But it seems the same. For me personally, it seems that I'd rather students, just like it seems there have been studies showing that there's certain learning and developmental things that happen in children from crawling, and if they skip crawling, they often will have learning disabilities. I wonder if it isn't similar with people learning how to learn, that sometimes I think waiting on the technology till later might be better. So at TAC, we only use books. We don't use iPads or computers. And I'm grateful because they will use it all they want outside, but I'm grateful that they're at least learning this technology of the book and the skill of conversation and how to learn both verbally and from the book. So that's...
So switching gears a little bit, here's a question for all of you. Should all kids go to college? Should all kids go to college?
No.
I mean, isn't that the dominant view out there these days? I mean, it's certainly a good thing for more people to go to college, and we have all sorts of government programs and spending and ways of
I think all
encouraging.
kids should have access to college, and all kids should be able to attend college if they so choose. But I would like to widen it because, I mean, I think and also an option to go to college later. I mean, you know, I didn't go to college until I was 25. And I'm really glad that I didn't because I wasn't ready. So I think having more options for college is also a good one. And we talked about this on Friday when we got together, like having more, you know, a wider acknowledgement that, whether you go to a community college and transfer to a four-year, or whether you go straight into a four-year, or whether you go to an Ivy League, or whether you go to a state school, it doesn't really, at the end of the day, that's not that important. Or if you end up coming out of high school and you start a business, and you bypass going to college, I think that every child should feel like there are options for them, but I do think, and again, I hope Katie weighs in on this, I do feel like, especially if you're in a population where equity and access to college isn't available, it's really important that we make it an option for those kids that might miss out. But on the other extreme is the pressure for those kids where it's expected to go immediately into a four-year school, that pressure is problematic as well. So both ends, I think.
Yeah. I can't really say it any better than that. The access part is critical, and I think that we can't ignore the statistics that a college education promotes lifetime wealth increase. When you look at and I don't have them on the top of my head right now, but there's a significant difference in the lifetime wealth of people who have graduated from college than those who have not. So if we're talking about the public education system in particular as being an opportunity for equal access to a successful and productive life as you go on, then we have to take that into consideration, because that's the difference. If you're going to change the status that you started with, if that's what you're looking at, if the education system is part of creating that opportunity for upward mobility, then college has to be a goal for most of the students in that system.
So I read an article in The Atlantic today that said that 34% of the population above age 25 in the US has a bachelor's degree or higher, and 26% of jobs require that degree. So do you think all kids should go to college? What I would say is we had this college for all mentality, and it was absolutely rooted in this idea of equality and equity and social mobility. I don't know if that's still a promise at the end of your college degree. I think maybe college has many, many other values and purposes, and sometimes that equates to economic mobility, but I don't think that guarantee is necessarily there anymore. But when we said college for all, then that kind of went to UC for all, which changed our whole high school academic structure, and we respond to that UC for all, which sometimes is good and sometimes is problematic. But what I would say is, at the end of the day, what we would hope is post-secondary training for all, whatever that looks like for you. High school should not be the end, but there are many forms of post-secondary training that can get you that income advancement that you want, that can get you the training that you want. I don't know what that looks like, but you should have access to any form of post-secondary training that's meaningful for you, whether that's four-year, community college, trade school, specific culinary school, whatever that looks like. Our job is to prepare you. But I don't think that the university for all model that we have currently dictating many, many levels and pieces of our high school is necessarily the right answer.
So I think that's helpful. Now, can you amplify a little bit, as we were talking about this a couple of days ago in preparing for this meeting, and I'm not sure people have a full appreciation of the point. Say more about how it is that pressure to go to college influences what happens in high schools.
Right. Sometimes we use college preparation as a proxy for deep and meaningful learning. And I would say, whether or not you go to college, everyone is entitled to deep and meaningful learning. Not just because you're in an AP class, not because you're in an IB class. Every single student in a school should have access to deep and meaningful learning, regardless of the title that comes before your class. So that's our work, but you do get into this pressure of classes being A through G approved, which means that you have to be in that class to be qualified to go to a UC. And I shared with this group on Friday, my son was in high school and not necessarily a spectacularly motivated student, very smart, lots of educators in the family, but wasn't necessarily doing really incredibly well. And he was in one class, a robotics class, and it wasn't A to G approved, and we took him out of the only class that he really liked because it wasn't A to G approved. and put him in all UC classes. He went to college for a semester and dropped out because it wasn't right for him, which we all knew, but the pressure to get him there was incredible, and the pressure on himself, right? He felt like he was not worthy if he didn't go to a four-year college. And he was. And I wish he had taken construction and sound engineering and all of those classes. So we put him in a community college. He majored in sound engineering. He's on a long-term completion plan. He loves what he's doing, but he had no access to that. In high school, it was just go to college, go to university, go to university, go to university. And that was really the only thing that he felt like he could do instead of getting that deep and meaningful learning in things that he was interested in.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cool.
So,
Tom?
Please.
Can I add to that? I think
Let me say something first, just quickly, very quick.
Moderators.
Practically. Start writing down your questions and get ready to hand them in, because somebody's going to come around and pick up your cards in a few minutes. Please.
I think Tiffany brings up such an excellent point, because that move to UC for all really then comes down into the high school, into the junior high, and it creates this systematic bias that, and this statement to the learning community that if you're not bound for that, or if you're not drawn toward that, if you're drawn to being more of a yeah man and working with your hands, that you are not as valuable a member of this learning community. And there is no place for you. It broke my heart to see Matilija's wood shop taken out. And I've had a lot of experience with a lot of intelligent people working jobs, making a lot more than I'll ever make as a teacher, that did not go to college, but still had some sense of feeling less than. And I think in our society, we've got to address this hierarchical idea that if you're good at analyzing essays or solving the quadratic formula, you're somehow more valuable of a person in our community. I mean, I think I learned in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that that's just not the case.
Tom, can I chime in there? I think we need to look at it from both perspectives. I've been talking about bias, right? I would limit my bias. I think everyone would benefit from a college education, but not necessarily UC or Ivy League or state or community college. As long as we're getting educated at a post-secondary arena, I think that's beneficial. But also when you talk about the expectations that you have to go to UC, or if you're not, I would say, what about the students who are from historically underrepresented groups? That's not even an option for them. So they're not even aware that college is an option for them. They're thinking, okay, this is my life. I'm gonna have to go out, I'm gonna get a job. And when I talk to some of our students, this is anecdotal evidence, of course, but many of them have told me, I never even thought about going to college until I met a college recruiter. It was not even part of the dialogue. And this person now is getting a PhD program, University of Kansas. So we need to think of it both ways. On one end, on one extreme, we have this extreme pressure. You got to get into these UC schools. On the other side, I don't even think that's on the radar for many of our students. And coming back to the bachelor's level degree kind of demand, I suppose, I guess that's the case nationally, but I know locally in California, I don't know if it's 2025 or 2030, we're going to be short a few thousand bachelor's degrees that are going to fill these jobs. So I think, there's definitely value in a bachelor's degree. It might not be the same guaranteed value as we had in the past, but it does provide, I do believe it provides an opportunity for social mobility. And when I work with the students, we talk about changing family trajectories, and I think that's so valuable to this other side, this group that has traditionally not been served well in our education system, particularly higher education.
And thank you for saying that, Richard, because it's really hard, right? So this is we're taking a simple look at a very complex problem, and I think it's different for every kid. There are absolutely some kids that should be going to Ivy League schools because that is where they want to go, and they've always wanted, and that is great for them, and our job is to prepare them for that, right? There are kids who have never thought about college, and our job is to open their eyes to college. There are some kids who have no idea what they want to do, probably more than either of those two, and our job is to help them see where they want to go and prepare them for the next steps. So this idea, is college for everyone, is an irrelevant question. The question is, what should we be doing to meet students' needs for wherever they're going to go once they exit the K-12 system?
Yep. Good. Okay, switching gears. This is a question mainly for Katie and Tiffany. What are the barriers to achieving continuous improvement in schools?
You want to start with that one? I'll start. Go for it.
So I think, I don't really love the word barriers, right? Because it implies, one, that there's something we have to get around or we can't get around. And I would say instead, what are the contexts that make it difficult for us sometimes in education, right? Because there are some things definitely that make it hard for us. And the first I would say is that the education system alone cannot compensate for the inequalities of our economic system. And I want to say that again because I think it's really important. The education system alone cannot compensate for the inequalities of our economic system. So when you leave that education system and the majority of jobs are minimum wage jobs, that is not education, that is a system that we have to look at together. And sometimes I think we look at education and we think that that's our fault, but I would say there's a lot of things that have to go hand in hand, right? So this idea that we were talking about, does the demand match the education process that we're going through, right? Are we putting people out with degrees, and is that in the areas where they're going to need jobs? All of those things have to be a system, and I think sometimes education is a little bit isolated from the other actors in the system, and that's hard for us.
I take that point, but I don't think it's exactly the question I'm asking.
Well, so I'm going to another one if you want. So I think that in education we have, I mean, if you want me to say money, I'll say money, right? Like, money's a barrier.
I mean, I'm really interested in what stands in the way of making improvements.
Well,
so we would all agree that our schools need to be improved.
Right.
Right here in Ojai?
I don't know. No, I wouldn't say that we would all agree. I would say there are some pieces of every school system that need to be improved. There are teachers doing amazing, amazing things with great kids in this district, and I would say that they are our bright spot. So I wouldn't say across the board that we have to be improved. I'd say there are certainly areas where we can grow.
I got it. I'll take some places.
Okay.
That's good enough for me. Some places that could be improved, and it would be beneficial to do that. My question is, what stands in the way of making those improvements?
So part of what I was getting at is there's this, kids come to us at varying levels of economic need, and the school system accounts for 20% of student outcomes, and 60% accounts for family. 60% of student outcomes are from the family. So we can do what we can do, but we have to holistically, in this town, in this county, in this state, in this country, look at the whole piece of making sure that kids come into the education system with as much equality as they can, right? So having universal preschool, having all of the childhood nutrition, all of those kinds of things are important to us as the K-12 system, because we don't start with them. I would say the second piece is really looking at our bright spots. So I'm glad you brought that up. There's a lot of deficit thinking because the system is very complex. And it's easy and simple to say, we all agree that schools have to be improved. And I would say, no, the system is really complex. I don't go to a hospital and say, I know how to run a hospital because I went there before. I don't. It's a really complicated issue. There's all kinds of things that we have to improve together as a system. So bringing the community in and saying, what do you think that we need to do? You as a community, what do you think the point of education in Ojai is? Do you want citizens? Do you want academics? Do you want to focus on economic skills? Those are the conversations that we have to have. So I think, again, this piece of the education system being isolated and not going out to the community and not being part of this holistic fabric of the community is actually one of our contexts that we have to work on. And that's why stepping out and saying, what is it that we want collectively for our children in our community? There's more in there.
I'd be happy to, because I don't disagree with anything you said. I think maybe there's another step to it that we could be talking about as well. So obviously, yes, we are dealing with a different kids coming into the system at different levels with different levels of preparation and so on. We tend to refer to this as the opportunity gap, so that we do understand that kids who've gone to preschool have a leg up by the time they start kindergarten. Kids who have had better nutrition, medical care, all of these things, the 0 to 5 space actually turns out to be extraordinarily important to the future of a kid's well-being. I think we're all pretty well aware of that. But the question becomes then, what do we do when we get kids into the K-12 system who are at these different levels, who haven't had the advantages of these kinds of preparations in the first 5 years of life? So what we do know is that there are some things that are working. You may know that Los Angeles probably has the largest number of charter schools in the country, and this is a hugely controversial situation right now politically, in every imaginable way, and I don't know how much of it is, is part of the discussion in Ojai, but it kind of dominates everything we try to do in Los Angeles. But what I will say about it is that, and charter schools are not all great by any means, but in that subset of schools, there are some that are doing an excellent job with specifically the kids who come in without having had those opportunities. So I would say that one of the barriers is that for some reason we aren't willing to look at what Tiffany referred to as the bright spots. I don't care what model of school you find them in, but if there is a school that's doing a really great job at providing that level of expectation that assumes that every kid has the ability to learn and will learn, let's figure out what those schools are doing and how do we replicate that in the larger system. The other thing I do think we need to address is the money situation. If you look at these, the charts on 14 and I don't remember, anyway, there's a real correlation when you look at the states that have the highest level of per pupil spending and the academic achievement, the performance levels. So money does matter. It isn't the only answer by any means. You can have a lot of money and spend it in all the wrong ways. But there are a few things that we do know, and that is that when you have more money in a public school system, you tend to have smaller class sizes. I think pretty much everyone would agree that that's probably beneficial. I think you're probably paying your teachers more. That's going to encourage more people to go into the profession, and it's going to encourage people who may be looking at other professions and who have the opportunity to go into other professions to think about teaching as a profession. So money is going to make a difference, and I could go on that list. But I think we also have to look at some of the things that are making a difference in the schools that are working, and one of those is autonomy. We have to be convinced that we have enough leadership in our schools that we can trust them, that we can trust our leaders to lead. And maybe that means we need to look at how we're preparing people to lead schools. Maybe we're not doing that the right way. I think the other thing you find is that there's a culture in these schools that everybody can learn. So it's that level of high expectations. There are a number of these things. I could go on for a while. It's probably a topic for a whole, another one of these panels. But those are the things that I would point out. Let's look at what's working and replicate it, and let's be honest about the fact that money does make a difference.
And while we're looking at this chart, I just want to point out, you'll see California is kind of in the middle, but 30% of the English learners in the entire country are educated in California. So, and we know that that takes extra resources, extra people, extra money, all kinds of extra things to help those students achieve. And yet we are not at the highest, and we have the highest percentage of by far. I think Texas has the next highest at 18%, but 1 out of every 3 approximately is in California, not reflected in our funding model.
So that's helpful. I think that relates to the first question from our audience. I haven't read it all, but I think so. I'll read it and we'll find out. In public spending by state, California spends approximately $12,000 per pupil, where Idaho and Utah spend around $7,000. When we look at rankings by state, Utah is 22nd and Idaho is 26th, compared to California is 37th, exclamation. Educators in our state keep clamoring for more money to improve our schooling. Is this the answer?
Well, there is another side to that. Can we look at the states that have the top levels of spending and how they're doing? Because I think that's really, in some ways, maybe that's the question. So New York spends twice as much on its kids, and I'm not sure where they are, but I know that they are above us on the performance. Yeah. So, and the same with New Jersey and Massachusetts. New York is 25th. Compared to 31. Massachusetts is number 1, right? I also question these.
And I think it's hard to do a straight correlation between the amount of spending and the ranking, because you also have things like poverty, English learners, special education, all of those things factor into your percentage, right? So there are just, kids come to us with certain conditions that require more resources in order for us to educate them to the same level of the kids who don't have those conditions, whatever those are. And so I think this takes all of that out of it, and I don't think it's a fair comparison.
So it seems like that raises the question of measurement. So we have ways of measuring and ranking and so on, and no metrics are perfect. We know that, but some are better than others. I mean, what about the measures that we use to measure performance in a school? Are there better ways to do it than we're doing it now?
I think they're the low-hanging fruit. You know, they measure those things that are easy to measure, and we figured out ways to measure, but they're less good at measuring creativity. They're less good at measuring a student's sense that they have agentic engagement, that they can engage with their own agency and make things happen that they want to learn about. I came across recently a pretty good tool to add to our assessment in schools that I think could raise a feeling of belongingness and kind of a metacognition in our students. It's called the Hope Survey. It's been included, Andy included it in the packet, though it talked a little bit, in this graphic it talks about the team cycle, but the Hope Survey basically, it measures engagement, and which I think we all would agree is huge. It's a thing that falls off strongly by the time students get to junior high and in high school. And I would argue that engagement is the gas in the fuel tank, right? Our current assessments, they measure the speed at which we go, right? They've got they measure the RPM, if you will, but we don't have a fuel gauge. We don't really know if our kids are engaged outside of behavioral engagement, but certainly behavioral engagement does not indicate deep learning. There's emotional engagement, there is our cognitive engagement, and of course the engagement of our own agency in learning. And these are some ways that we can move to help kids feel more socially embedded in their community, and because the emotions get there first, right?
So if I'm right, if I understand right, engagement would be in the service of learning. The idea
Engagement
would be
in
more,
indeed
so
in the
how are we going
service
to
of
measure the
learning.
learning that we think is related to engagement?
I think if you don't need to measure the learning as much as you think you need to measure the learning, if the environment is rich, if the child is engaged, the learning will be what it will be, and I would say that's good enough for each individual child, personally.
Richard, what do you
I'm going to
think?
chime in. I would agree with you wholeheartedly on engagement. We know in higher education that academic aptitude is not always the best predictor of success, particularly for our student body population. And we know that, especially being in student affairs, level of engagement, sense of belonging to the campus community, that's a huge factor. The more engaged they are on those multiple levels, like you mentioned, the better success outcomes that we see. But I would take it a step further and say, at least in higher education, I feel strongly that we have to measure learning outcomes. So I think in higher ed, the most basic and fundamental way we measure effectiveness is through retention, persistence, and graduation rates, obviously. But we slice that and dice it by demographic, by historically underrepresented groups, first generation students, and we look at those metrics. But we cannot fail to assess what happens along the way to ensure that graduation. Student engagement is one of those things, but we look at that on two levels. One, from an academic level, what are those student learning outcomes by discipline? So as a psychologist, I want to make sure that my students who are majors, they know something about correlation not meaning causation. They know something about basics, theories of personality, and we have direct measures of assessment on the academic side. I would say for the student affairs side, it's a little more challenging because these are more qualitative things. How do you measure leadership? How do you measure sense of belonging? How do you measure grit? And we're in the process of, there's some measures out there and we're using that. So I think we need to look at it from both perspectives, the student learning outcomes, both student affairs and academic affairs, and how that funnels up to those student success metrics. And that's been challenging in student affairs. One of the things we always focus on in student affairs traditionally is this idea of student development and student learning outside the classroom. And one thing that I've brought to Channel Islands and have explicitly stated, if our students are learning and they're growing and developing, but they're not graduating, then we have problems. We need to rethink what are they learning and how are they developing.
That's excellent. Can I clarify something? A lot of what I'm speaking to is for K through 12 education, and I would agree with you, Richard, that at a university level, you do need those assessments. I also would add that our assessment at the high school level, is maybe a little outdated. It's currently, largely it's based on grade, but it's also based on something called the Carnegie unit, which is basically how many hours you've been in that seat in that classroom, right? It does nothing for the student who can learn something quickly and agilely There's no test for mastery. If I already know something, which nowadays we don't know what our students know, if a student already knows something, I have to sit in that class for a certain number of hours because UC will not let me in unless I have enough Carnegie units. And this is something that's been around for 100 years, and it came out of holding the professors at the universities tenure, or their retirement accounts. TIAA CREF is a Carnegie fund, and they said, well, if you guys will all adapt this Carnegie unit or adopt it, you can have a good retirement fund with us. So I would like to see us move towards more competency-based type of systems. They have their own challenges. Just because a kid knows something, that gets back to that transactional thing, and I'd like to see education be more of a push back and forth and dialogue. But I think we could do education at a better rate if those kids who knew something already could show their competency and move along. I sat in class bored oftentimes when I knew things for a long period of time, and it is crushing.
And the funding model didn't prevent that from happening, right? Because right now, the funding model, you also get funding in the state for kids being in seats.
Right.
So there's
Right.
no financial incentive necessarily for the
Right.
school system to move you forward, because then essentially, so the days of graduating early, like I did, are over because you lose money.
Right.
So the
it's a
funding model
systemic
has to be
issue.
part of that systematic thinking.
Yeah.
So Richard, just a quick point of clarification. I know that you're concerned about grade inflation related to graduation rate. So if graduation rate is the outcome measure, how do you control for essentially grade inflation?
Well, that's part of the rigor of the institution. I think the institution is responsible for that. So the provosts, deans, chairs are responsible for ensuring that there's a level of rigor, and you can do that in a number of ways. Obviously, you look at some metrics like grade distribution, right? What does a grade distribution look like? Is it heavily A's, and a bunch of A's and no B's, C's, D's, and F's? Because in any class, you're going to have a bit of a distribution. So you want to look at grade distribution. You want to look at things like, DFW rates, drop, fail, withdrawal rates, and things like that, particularly in those gateway courses, because we know the gateway courses in that first year are good predictors of success. If students can be successful in those first year courses and continue and persist into the second year, that's an excellent predictor for future success. So there are ways to measure that level of rigor.
Can I share just really quickly? So when I was in 8th grade in California, there was a science test, a golden seal of science or something like that. I tried to look it up today. It's so old I couldn't even find it. But I took a test in 8th grade, and I did an experiment, like a science experiment. And they sent little bottles, and we had to mix things, and I passed. And I got this little seal on my 8th grade graduation certificate, and I thought to myself, I'm really good at science. Mm-hmm. Not because I memorized something, but because I had done something and shown that I was good at science. And I became a science teacher, and I have this bias towards science, and I really think that part of that activity that I did, I mean, who remembers standardized tests from when you were a kid, right? But you know what happened? We stopped doing that because it was really expensive, because the kits were expensive, and so we don't do it anymore. But I just want to bring that up because there's a way in which we can do assessments and collect data that actually is impactful for the person who's involved, where you can say, I have done and accomplished something and that feels good, or I have areas of growth. And I think as we're looking at what does that look like, I think taking the person being measured into account is an important piece for us to consider, even if it's expensive and not easy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I have one more question, and then I'll go to the audience's questions. This is for Tiffany. Recently, we've heard that some Ojai schools have been red flagged for low performance. Can you tell us about that, and more broadly, what are you working on now within the Ojai Unified School District, and what support do you need?
Sure. So we've talked about this kind of ad nauseum at our board meeting and the newspaper. The data for those two schools, Miners Oaks and Matilija, is from the 17-18 school year. We actually just saw our new data for last school year. I can't tell you about it because it's embargoed, but I'm very excited for that to come out. So essentially, of 4 metrics, the state picked those 2 schools did poorly on those metrics. I don't know that those metrics necessarily mean that they are failing schools. It means that on those 4 metrics, our schools either did poorly or they went down. So there are the other schools that scored lower than our schools, but because they went up from the bottom, they weren't on that list. So we went the wrong direction, particularly on 2 of them, chronic absenteeism and suspension rate. Those are two things that we're really focusing on because you can't learn if you're not in school. So chronic absenteeism, and again, in a school like Miners Oaks, it's just a couple of kids that make that go down, right? Not to say we don't have work to do, but the margin is very small at a smaller school. So it's good that we know where we have areas to grow. We definitely, across the district, have areas to grow in math and areas to grow in English language arts. You can see statewide that's true everywhere, and we in particular have room to grow. In this packet, we included our brand new vision statement that our school board, and I'd like to point out Shelley Griffin, who's in our school board, who just was part of authorizing this like 2 weeks ago. So this is our vision, and you'll notice it's a student-centered vision. It's not bullets about what we're going to do. It's what we want kids to feel like when they are in our school system. So what does it feel like to be here? How are we modeling your academics, and then what is our connection to the community? So we're really excited to start with this vision and then to roll that out. So there's a lot of things that we're working on specific to those 4 metrics, particularly some new math work. We have new English language arts training that we just did with some new instructional aids that we think are going to help to lower those class sizes and really make an impact. And then the center of this vision is the social emotional learning, which is making sure that kids feel good when they are at school, that school is serviceful to them, and then working on those kids and families when they have a potential to be chronically absent, or when we might suspend them, really working on them through restorative justice to see if there's an alternative to that. So that data is a couple of years old. It's great because it gives us a guidepost of where we need to go to improve, and I look forward to our new scores coming out soon and seeing how we've done.
Please.
Can I ask a question? I actually have a question, both for Tiffany and Katie, about this. I'm just wondering, this is because I've worked with teachers and I have family members who are teachers, and I'm interested in both of you as more administrative position and what you have to deal with. What about the reality that I've heard anecdotally from several teachers that these tests sometimes are a real hardship on the teachers? That I've heard from several teachers that they find it interferes with their work as teachers, a sort of feeling of distrust of them, but also